Very short review from Sunday night. Here it is. Esther, the Jewess, is queen of Persia. Just to set the stage again to see what's happening. They're out of the land. Israel has been kicked out of the land for idolatry and disobedience. They've spent 70 years in Babylon. It was at the end of that 70-year period that the Persians and the Medes defeated Babylon. That's why we're in the kingdom of Persia, in case anybody has wondered, wait a minute, what about Babylon? I thought Israel went out to Babylon. Well, they did. But God had Babylon defeated by the Persians and by the Medes, and that's what we're seeing here. That's why Esther is the queen of Persia, not Babylon. Babylon fell to Persia. The second thought, her cousin Mordecai, the Jew, the Jewish Benjamite. Remember, he's of the family of Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. That's the same tribe that King Saul was from. So Mordecai, the Jewish Benjamite, won't bow down and give special respect to Haman, the Gentile Agagite. Remember, Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites, whose king was Agag. And that's this underlying tension between Mordecai and Haman, that they have been enemies for a long, long time. The people of Benjamin and the people of Amalek, whose king was Agag. And that's why the story mentions that Mordecai was from the tribe of Benjamin and that Haman is an Agagite. All these things have meaning. That's why the Lord gives us these facts. Haman asked the king to kill, destroy, and annihilate all the Jews in the kingdom of Persia. Haman wants all the Jews killed because of this one Jew, Mordecai. He can't stand Mordecai. He can't stand the fact that Mordecai, in Haman's view, is so arrogant and won't bow down to him when the king commanded everyone to bow to Haman. Mordecai won't do it. And so Haman, instead of just killing Mordecai, he wants all the Jews killed. Remember in the edict, let's just read these. The king agrees. The king agrees with Haman, and he gives Haman the authority to write the destruction of the Jews into law. Not just go do it, but make it a Persian law that all the Jews will be killed. And so when we left the story, Haman was happy. Look what it says in verse 13 of chapter 3. In verse 13 of chapter 3, it says, letters were sent. Letters were sent by carriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict is to be issued as law. Remember what happens with the Persian law? Once it's made into law, it cannot be repealed. So when the king gives Haman the authority to do this, he signs the death warrant of every Jew alive in the Persian Empire. It says a copy of the edict was to be issued as law in every province, was published to all the people so that they should be ready for this day. I just want to show you a quick picture of the Persian Empire again. Here is where all these events are taking place in the city of Susa. There's a big citadel there, a big building, a big complex of royal buildings. I also want you to see that Israel, right here, did you see it pop in? This little red rectangle? Israel is within the kingdom of Persia. Now, I've told you before in the book of Esther, Esther and Mordecai are not observing Jews. They're not observing the laws of Moses that God gave the Jews to obey. They're not. If they were, they would have gone back to Israel, to the promised land, but instead they refused to do it. For whatever reason, we're not given that reason, but they refuse as good Jews to go back to Israel and to commence their lives in the tribal area that God had given to their tribe. They refused to do it. But God is using this story of Esther and this event not only to save Esther and Mordecai in Susa, but I just want to show you this. I'm getting ahead of myself. But Israel is within the land that Persia controls. So if all the Jews in the Persian Empire are to be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew in Israel will be killed. You get that? Now, I want to say another thing before we get going. Because this all started because I tell you that Satan, from the day that God told him in the garden, I'm going to send a deliverer to deliver mankind. I'm going to send a Savior to earth. Not only is he going to save humanity, but he's going to destroy you, Satan. He's going to crush you on the head. And we started down this road to show the ways that Satan has tried to stop that promise from taking place. He wants to defeat God and make God not able to bring the seed. Now, it's interesting because in the genealogies of Jesus Christ, we know exactly where the seed of the woman is during the story of Esther. We know who is on earth carrying the seed of the woman. His name is Zerubbabel. If you write this down, Matthew chapter 1, verse 12, Zerubbabel is in the line of Jesus Christ, and it's Zerubbabel who rebuilt the temple of Solomon. When they went back into the land after the 70-year exile, it was Zerubbabel who was in charge of rebuilding the temple. So Zerubbabel is in the land of Canaan. He's back in the promised land. What city is he in? If he's rebuilding the temple, what city is he in? He's in Jerusalem. So at this moment, we know that the seed of the woman, we know because what Matthew 1 says, who Jesus' ancestors are. We know that during this story, the seed of the woman is in Jerusalem in the person of Zerubbabel. It's Zerubbabel who will have a child who will continue the line of the seed that eventually becomes Jesus Christ. The reason I say that is if the Persian Empire kills all of its Jews, that includes Zerubbabel, who is in Jerusalem. That's the point of that. He will also be killed. Satan's not as interested in all the Jews and all the kingdoms. The problem for Satan is he's not omniscient the way God is. He doesn't know who the seed is. He doesn't know who the seed carrier is exactly. We do, looking backwards, because we have the whole Bible completed. Satan didn't know. So he had to kill all the Jews. The only way he could win and annihilate that seed that was going through the Jewish people was to kill all the Jews. So that's what we got going on. I hope that's a decent review. Remember, just for the sake of maps, a modern day map will slide over just so you can see what's what. And you see that Susa is right on the Iranian-Iraqi border. It's a city in Iran, modern day Iran. And like I've told you, they still call themselves Persians. Let's start Esther chapter 4. It says, when Mordecai, Haman has been talking to the king. Haman has sent this edict on the 13th of the 12th month. All the Jews will be killed, destroyed, and annihilated. And Mordecai the Jew finds out about it. It says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the midst of the city, in the middle of the city, and he wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate. Remember, it was Mordecai. Mordecai is some sort of low-level official in the king's government. He is allowed to be at the king's gate, where the judges are, where people bring their conflicts, etc. Mordecai is one of those people. So it says he went as far as the king's gate. He was allowed to be there, but he didn't go any further, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. So he couldn't enter. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, the command to kill all the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month, in each and every province where the command came, there was great mourning among the Jews. And they fasted, there was weeping, there was wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. This was a way, the sackcloth is like burlap. This was a way that they mourned, they wept. When they were in great despair, they would take off their normal clothing, they would put on sackcloth and take dirt from the ground and cover themselves with ash and with dust, with ash and dust. So that's what's happening with all the Jews. They're horrified at what's going to happen. Can you imagine somebody setting a date for the destruction of all the inhabitants of Sweeny, Texas? I mean, can you imagine the thought? I mean, it's just so foreign to how we think. But this king put this into law. Everyone you loved, all your family, all the tribes of Israel, the promised people, the chosen people of God, the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of a sudden the reality in their lives was that a Persian king had made a law and it could never be changed. That's a death sentence. It's over. It's all over. Except for God. Verse 4 says, Then Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and they told her. What did they tell her? That Mordecai was out in the streets weeping and wailing. So Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. So Esther's told about Mordecai and what he's up to, but Esther doesn't know yet why Mordecai is mourning. She hasn't heard of the king's law, the hatred of Haman against the Jews. She doesn't know this yet. So now in verse 5, we start this conversation between Esther and her cousin Mordecai, the two Jews, the only two Jews that we know of in the story by name. So they start to converse back and forth through this person named Hathach. Hathach is one of the people that's a servant to Esther, and he's the go-between for all these conversations. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, so he's one of her servants. And she ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Mordecai, why are you doing this? Why are you in sackcloth? Why are you mourning loudly for everyone to hear? So he did it. It says in verse 6, Hathach went out to meet Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him. What had happened to Mordecai? Remember in the story, Mordecai was commanded to bow down to Haman. Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, and when they asked him why, what was his reason? Why won't he bow down to Haman? What was his reason? Just because he's a Jew. That was his reason, because I'm a Jew. This is what Esther is finding out when it says everything about Mordecai. She found out Mordecai told the man all that had happened to him. So he was commanded to bow down to Haman. He refused because he was a Jew. And then Mordecai used this event, or Haman, used this event to convince the king to kill all the Jews. That's what Esther is now about to find out. She doesn't know any of what we have already learned from the story. So look at what it says. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. I wonder if Mordecai, this is just a Rick wonder, but I wonder if Mordecai feels to blame. I wonder if Mordecai thinks, I have destroyed my people Israel. My arrogance in not bowing to this man. He wasn't asked to worship Haman. He was just asked to bow down and pay special respect to him. I wonder if Mordecai blames himself for the death sentence that he's brought on every Jew in the Persian Empire. It may be. Maybe not, but it may be. And so he's telling this servant of Esther's what has happened and adding to it the fact that Haman was so passionate about the destruction of Israel that he offered to pay for it. And in verse 8, he also did something else for Esther. Now, Esther doesn't know any of this yet. Her go-between, this man Hatak, is getting this information. But Mordecai also gave him, Hatak, a copy of the text of the edict. He gives him a copy of the law that says on the 13th day, on the 12th month, all the Jews are to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated. So he gives her a copy of the text which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her. And there's something else he wants to do to cousin Esther. He wants to order her, make her. Cousin Mordecai is sending an order to Esther to go into the king to implore or to beg for his favor and to plead with him for her people. So Hatak has just found out something very interesting about Esther. What is it? She's a Jew. He's the first guy in all of the Persian Empire, except for Mordecai, to know that she's a Jew. And it's interesting that Hatak must have been a loyal servant to Esther, because he didn't say a word. He didn't go to the king. He didn't go to Haman. He just went back to Esther and told her what Mordecai told him to say. So verse 9 says, Hatak came back and he related Mordecai's words to Esther. And verse 10, Esther's response is not very encouraging, because what we read is that Esther doesn't want to do it. What did Mordecai just order her to do? Go into the king. And Esther says, I'm not interested in that. Why? Look what it says. Then Esther spoke to Hatak. So after she hears Mordecai's words from Hatak, this is her response. She ordered him to reply to Mordecai. This was the response. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law for all of those people, that he be put to death. So Esther is saying to Mordecai, the king has a rule that he's not to be disturbed. And unless he calls for someone, yes, even me, his wife, unless he summons me and calls for me to come into his presence, if I show up in his presence uninvited, I am to be killed. So that's her response to Mordecai. I'm not going to go to the king unless he summons me. It's a death sentence. Interesting. What else is Esther under right now on the 13th day of the 12th month? A death sentence. So, she also says, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. So the king has a scepter. And if someone approaches the king that hasn't been summoned by the king, and the king sends out his scepter or holds out his scepter to that person, then the king is saying, it's okay, you may approach. You may come in. I won't have you killed. But she goes on to say, I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. So 30 days have gone by and Esther hasn't been summoned by the king for any reason. She hasn't seen her husband, the king, in 30 days. She's not been summoned for him, by him to come to her. So she does not know whether she'll be invited, whether she'll be welcomed when the king sees her. She has no way of knowing whether the king is upset with her, and that's maybe why he hasn't called her for 30 days. But a month is a long time for a man not to see his wife. So Esther says, I don't want to do it. So in verse 12, this man Hatak, he related Esther's words to Mordecai. You can see this guy going back. Esther says this, going back over here. Mordecai says this, going back. Esther says this. This poor guy is caught in the middle of this. And this is a matter of life and death. I mean, this is no joke. I joke about it, but this is no joking matter. This is a matter of life and death. And these two people, Esther and Mordecai, are trusting this man Hatak to exactly say what each of them says. Of all the heroes in the Bible, of all the men that saved Israel in the Bible, I don't think we put any... I've never heard this man's name before the book of Esther. I've never heard it taught by anybody. I've never heard the man's name other than before we came into this book. But I would hold this man, Hatak, up as one of the great heroes of Israel. He didn't rat the woman out when he found out she was a Jew, and he is faithfully and honestly going back and forth between these two Jews at the risk of his own life and telling exactly the truth to each of them. Now this is a good name for a pet, Hatak. So they related Esther's words to Mordecai. In verse 13, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. See, before it says in verse 8, order her to go into the king. Esther says, I don't want to do it. Mordecai says, okay, tell it to her this way. Let's just get a little more serious about this situation. She obviously doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. So Mordecai says to Hatak to go tell his cousin, listen, cousin, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. You are Jewish. On the 13th day of the 12th month, you will die. Don't think that you're something special because you're in the king's palace. Interesting to me, I would have added something about Queen Vashti and how easily she was kicked out. Because that's a little bit of this story too. Would the king kick her out just for being Jewish? Yes, he would have. So he says, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, when all the Jews are subject to death, a law has been written. Esther, don't you get this? If you remain silent at this time, then relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. That's an interesting statement. What does Mordecai seem to know? That the Jews are God's chosen people, that the Jews have a future. He seems to know the Abrahamic promises. We don't see him worshiping Yahweh here, but to make the statement, if you don't save us, Esther, then Yahweh will relieve and deliver Israel in some other way. It seems to indicate to me that Mordecai understood that the Jews will be saved somehow. I don't know how else to interpret that phrase. Relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. What will happen to you if you remain silent? You and your father's house will perish. You're all going to die. The 13th day of the 12th month of the year, Adar, just like the rest of the Jews. And then he makes this famous statement to her as if to gird her and strengthen her and firm her up. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Esther, remember back to the days when you were young, when your father and mother died, and I took you into my care. Did we ever in a million years dream that you would be the queen of Persia? No. But perhaps God knows. And perhaps, see, God's not mentioned in this book by name, but I think Mordecai is speaking the truths of God when he says these things. Who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? Maybe Yahweh has delivered you up, has raised you up into the royal family so that you can do what Joseph did for our forefathers. Interesting. It's at least interesting words from Yahweh. Again, if Mordecai was interested in observing all of the Mosaic law, Mordecai would have gone back to the land of Israel. He would be living within the tribal allotment of Benjamin. He would be living among his family members. He would be going to Jerusalem and worshiping God there. He chose not to do that. So he's not an observant Jew. But he does seem to, at least, as I said, understand that Yahweh will save Israel somehow. He seems to understand the promises that God made to Israel, that Israel will be delivered. Interesting. But either way, what he's trying to tell Esther here is, cousin, you're going to die. You're either going to die in a few months with all of us, or you're going to die when you approach the king. One of those two ways, you will die. There's no other option. And so in verse 15 we read, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, I need help. I want you to assemble. He says, go. Esther tells her cousin, go and assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Now, we're not told that there's any type of prayer in this fasting. Prayer is not mentioned. But I just refuse to believe that all of the Jews in Susa, that there was no one that was praying to Yahweh for the deliverance of his own people. So she says, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, fast for me, do not eat or drink for these 3 nights. She asked for a 3-day fast. Don't eat or drink night or day. And what is she going to do? She's going to also fast. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus, after having fasted for 3 days, I'll go into the king, which is not according to the law. I have not been summoned. And then she says, and if I perish, I perish. A brave and courageous soul, Esther is here. She receives the information from Mordecai. She understands how serious the situation is. She realizes she really doesn't have a choice. So she has resolved herself to do it, and she says, if I perish, I perish. You could take that in a very negative sense, that she's fatalistic. I read a lot of people that think it's a very fatalistic statement. I just don't choose to take it that way. I think it's a very, very courageous statement on her part. It took courage to do that, to go into the king, and so she did it. She's a hero in my book. She's a disobedient hero. But God chose to use this woman and her cousin Mordecai to save all of history, to save everything. Friends, to save you and to save me. If there's no Mordecai in this story, if there's no Esther in this story, there's no Jesus Christ, and there's no salvation, we're done for. But he chose to use Esther and Mordecai. For what reason? Reasons all his own. I don't need to know. I just thank him for loving the Jews and for being a faithful God who kept his promise. Even when Jews were unfaithful to him, God found a way to push forward with his plan and save Israel so that he could save the world through Israel's Messiah, Jesus. Verse 17 says, so Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. So Mordecai gathers all the Jews in Susa. He assembles the group and they fast for 3 days while Esther and her maids also fast. Look at what it says in Esther chapter 5. Let's keep pushing. Yahweh makes his move. Earlier I said Satan makes his move. When Haman entered into the scene and Haman went to the king and said, let's kill them all. Satan made his move. It's a chess move. Check, he says to the Lord God. Check, I've got you. You're in a position you can't leave from. The king of the empire has said that all your precious Jews are going to die. And there's nothing that can be done on earth to stop it. I mean, humanly, isn't this the most desperate situation you can be in? There's a law that you're going to die on the 13th day of the 12th month. And in this empire, laws can't be rewritten. They can't be changed. It's over from a human standpoint. Unless God steps in, and I mean steps into human history personally and changes this situation for Israel, it's over. Satan wins. Because the Jews are sentenced to die. So God moves in. In Esther chapter 5, verse 1, it says, now it came about on the 3rd day of this fast that Esther put on her royal robes And she stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's room. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. Esther is an eye shot of the king. One of two choices. Be killed because I didn't summon you, or the king will shoot out his scepter. One or the other, that's it. So she's done it. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. And so Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Look at this picture if you haven't yet. Look up here at this picture. I love that one. Shows not only the event that the king Ahasuerus is handing out the scepter and allowing Esther to come into his presence, but I like it because it also shows the grandeur. Of course, it's only an artist's idea, but it shows the grandeur of this citadel in Susa. We're not talking about a little tent. We're talking about a well-made, laden with gold, very high-level palace. Sometimes we think about Bible things and we just think too little. This was the empire of Persia and the king of an empire that ruled most of the world at that time, most of the populated world at least. So he has allowed Esther into his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of his scepter. So the first hurdle has been crossed. The king has allowed Esther into his presence. Then the king said to her, certainly if Esther has come to him without having been summoned, knowing that the law is that if you come to the king without a summons, you die, certainly there's something serious going on, Queen Esther. What do you need? That's what he asks her. What is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? There's no other reason for her to be there except she needs something. What is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you. So the king is saying, I'll give you anything you ask. She must have been some kind of woman. I hate that she's not a worshipful Jew. I really like this woman. I wish she would have been worshiping her God properly. I love her heroism. I love what she did. I love at the sake of risking her own life, she approached her husband, knowing that at that moment right there, he could have said, off with her head. I love this woman as a great heroine of Israel. But I hate that I also have to say this woman wasn't properly obeying her God. Hard to say. So the king asked her, having great regard for his beautiful queen Esther, he asks her, what can I do for you? I will meet your demands, whatever they are. Esther said, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him. What does she say? Invite Haman over for lunch. I've prepared a meal, and I want me, you, and Haman, nobody else. So the king said, bring Haman quickly. Immediately he gives the demand, the request. He fills the request. Bring Haman quickly that we may do as Esther desires. So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Keep listening. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther again, what is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done. He asks her the same thing and makes the same promise. You asked me to get Haman here for dinner? Here he is. What else do you want? Certainly this isn't it. So Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and do what I request, May the king and Haman come to the banquet which I prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says. So we're not told here what's going on and what is happening in Esther's mind, but I want to unravel it for you just a minute, and we're going to stop there. Esther has called for this banquet on this day, but she's not ready to tell the king who Haman is. She's not ready to reveal who Haman is, this great hater of the Jews. She's not ready to tell the king that she also is a Jew. What she comes to say is, let's meet again tomorrow. And we're not told why tomorrow. There are some options because we're humans. She was human just like we are. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she got into the situation and she panicked and she said, let's do it again tomorrow. And maybe I won't be scared then. Maybe the king was not in a mood. And as his wife, she knew the man's not in a mood to hear what I have to say. I mean, who knows what human event took place that Esther said, not today, but tomorrow, just me, the king, and Haman again. The same situation, same banquet table, probably very similar food, but let's do it tomorrow. What we find out about this night changes the history of the world. Esther may not know why she wanted to wait until tomorrow, but somehow Yahweh, God, put it in her mind that tomorrow was a better day than today for the news that she was about to give the king. And as we'll read in this story when we get to chapter 6, that God was at work on the very night between these two banquets to save the entire world, to change the course of history the way almost no single night ever has in this book, except for the day that they crucified Jesus and 3 days later when he rose from the dead. What you read in the book of Esther is one of the turning point evenings in the history of humanity, in the history of the story of the redemption or the saving of humanity. We see that in between these two banquets on the night that I don't know that Esther even knows why she asked for tomorrow. But God knows. And it's on this night that he will change the mind of the king. When God will move a king, the Bible says that God moves kings where he will. And on this night, between this first banquet and the one tomorrow, God will change the world. And I'm here to thank him for it, because if he wouldn't have done what he does on this night, you and I would spend an eternity in the lake of fire separated from God. It's an incredible night in the history of the world. And it's interesting to me that not very many people talk about it, because to me, it's one of those things in the Bible that all these arrows point to this night in the history of Israel and the history of salvation. We'll pick up there next time we meet, Sunday. No, not Sunday, next Wednesday, because Sunday is the day I go to Carriage Inn in the afternoon. So we'll pick up there again next Wednesday. Let's close in prayer.